Nick Norowitz just published a self-experiment where he lowered his bad or LDL cholesterol with 12 Oreo cookies every day for 2 weeks. Yeah, he dropped his LDL cholesterol by 70%, twice the effect that the high-dose statin had when he took it for 6 weeks. I'm going to explain the mechanism for why Oreo cookies lowered the LDL cholesterol, but there are caveats to this information. This study does not mean that everybody who attempts this will lower their LDL cholesterol. This study does not mean that Oreo cookies are good for you. And this study does not prove that LDL cholesterol is not a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. What this does is opens a conversation about LDL cholesterol and the ketogenic diet. So let's begin. What is this study design? Well, the baseline ketogenic diet is something Nick Norowitz had been on for 5 years, but he took really careful metrics for the 2 weeks prior to starting the study. And on day 1, he began eating a higher amount of carbs, specifically an extra 100 carbohydrates in the form of Oreo cookies. Yes, a sleeve of Oreos was consumed every day for the next 2 weeks. During that time, he stayed on his strict ketogenic diet, but because he knew that those Oreos were going to kick him out of ketosis, he took ketone supplements in the form of BHB. So on day 1, before that first Oreo, his LDL-C, or his bad cholesterol on a cholesterol panel, was 384. After a week of taking a sleeve of Oreos, his LDL cholesterol had lowered to 308. Pretty significant improvement, but nothing when you compare it to what they saw at the end of 2 weeks. His LDL cholesterol was down to 140. And he and his primary care physician had a tough time believing the data. So they said, let's eat a couple more days of Oreos and check again, where they had 129 on day 15 and then 111 on the 16th day of those Oreo cookies. That is a 71% reduction in his LDL cholesterol in 2 short weeks. Why Oreo cookies? Well, Nick didn't want anybody to be able to argue that the form of carbohydrate was healthy, and we can all agree that Oreos are not a health food. Any carbohydrate would have worked. Let's give a bit of background to who this case study is about. Nick Norowitz is 28 years old. He is in his 3rd year of medical school at Harvard Medical School and has a PhD from Oxford. So he's a bit of a smarty pants, but he's also quite curious. The curiosity about a ketogenic diet is because Nick ended up on a ketogenic diet after a severe autoimmune disorder nearly derailed his training. After he was healed from the inside out by a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, he found his cholesterol to be quite high. In the process of trying to understand this, he found this term, lean mass hyperresponder. Lean mass hyperresponder was coined in 2017 by Dave Feldman, a citizen scientist who also had felt better after a ketogenic diet, but had a cholesterol shooting off the charts. Both of these gentlemen, along with thousands of others, have found the improvements in their health coupled with the scare that their LDL cholesterol was causing this severe risk for heart disease. These folks who tend to rise their cholesterol high have an inverse relationship with their body mass index, meaning the higher their cholesterol goes on a ketogenic diet, the leaner they were. After a few people had identified that they belonged in this group, we used some criteria to better identify who are these patients. Well, they're folks that on a ketogenic diet have an LDL-C north of 200. They also have a very high HDL, higher than 80, and their triglycerides are in the double digits, usually below 70. These patients look like this, with pretty high definition of muscle mass, having a total body percentage of fat less than 20 for men and less than 23 for women. These patients are often moderate to very fit. They're very active patients, and they are usually on a very low-carb ketogenic diet. So what was this study looking at? Well, these lean mass hyperresponders are found to have several of these low cardiovascular risks listed here. What they have a high amount of is something known to be a high risk for cardiovascular disease. They have a high LDL-C. Their LDL particle count is high. Their ApoB is high. And what all 3 of these markers are measuring is the same thing. That unit that carries cholesterol and fat around to the body. All three of these metrics are measuring the same thing. That spherical structure that leaves the liver and delivers the high-fat lipophilic or fat-loving molecules to the cells in need of energy. So why is the LDL cholesterol high in these lean mass hyperresponders? Well, they've used a lipid energy model to try and explain that. We're going to need 3 body parts to tell this story. We're going to need the muscle cells, the fat cells, and the liver. When lean mass hyperresponders come onto the ketogenic diet, their liver is filled with the short-term fuel, glucose fuel called glycogen. When they start on a ketogenic diet, that glycogen depletes. This liver looks empty, but it's relative. So the amount of fuel stored in their liver in the form of glucose is now very small, insufficient enough to supply the body with energy. So the body turns to the next source of fuel, often found in the fat cells. Inside the fat cells, triglycerides are broken down into sources of energy. Strings of fat, called fatty acids, are delivered to muscle cells and the liver. A very small amount of glucose accompanies that fat delivery. From the liver, you'll see some of that fat adding ketones into circulation. This is where the name ketogenic diet comes from. And although a fat is the highest supply of energy on a ketogenic diet, we still call it a ketogenic state. As ketones flow from the liver and those fat molecules are being delivered to any cell in need of energy, this part of the ketogenic diet is not contested. Everyone agrees that's what happens in a ketogenic state. It's at this point of the education that Nick is trying to test the model of LDL-C. As you package fat in the liver to be delivered to your body, it comes in the form of a lipoprotein called VLDL. That VLDL finds its end organ, whether that's fat cells or other cells, and delivers the best nutrients out of that lipoprotein called a triglyceride. After those triglycerides exit the remnant called VLDL, we now call it an LDL. But do not miss the point that it's the same remnant, it's the same molecule that has been resized and now looks differently because there's very few triglycerides, and the only thing really left in an LDL is a majority of the cholesterol. This is how it got its name as the bad cholesterol, but it's really no different than the other ones. It's just empty of triglycerides. What happens when LDL has done delivering those triglycerides? It recycles back to your liver and gets refilled, repackaged, and the cycle starts over again. Take notice of those catcher's mitts that grab the LDL cholesterol and pull it into the liver. These LDL receptors are very important in the process of what we're about to test. So take a look at this image. That's what happens. VLDLs deliver their triglycerides. We call them LDLs, and they get recycled back into the liver. This is normal. So as our lean mass hyperresponder named Nick Norowitz starts on his Oreo sleeve per day plan, his blood sugar gets higher. More blood sugar than he can burn in the moment. So what does his body do? Well, it stores that extra blood sugar in the liver. And now, after about a week of having Oreos every day, his liver has been repleted or replenished with that glycogen, stored glucose. The rules of your liver are when glucose is in abundance inside the liver, it doesn't make as many lipoproteins to transport that fat around. You'll notice that the recycling of the emptied LDL cholesterol is still being reduced in his blood. So over that period of time where he's consuming those Oreos, the recycling of the LDL is happening, but the production of the VLDL is much less because of that glucose found in his liver. Essentially, Nick went from a fat-based energy model when he was in his lean mass, hyper-responding ketogenic diet to a glucose or sugar-based energy model when he added all of those Oreos. And Oreos did a fantastic job of replenishing the glucose inside Nick's liver, but any carbohydrate would have done. Pasta, rice, potatoes, or Cheerios. Nick was really careful to give himself a 3-month washout period. No one can argue that there was plenty of time to reset on a strict ketogenic setting. As he began the next phase of the study, his LDL cholesterol had risen right back up to where it had been for many of the years prior to this experiment. He then started on rosuvastatin, one of the most potent statins at reducing LDL cholesterol. He didn't just take a little dose, he took 20 milligrams of rosuvastatin. At 4 weeks, he has reduced his LDL cholesterol by 32%. But keep in mind, he did that 70% reduction in 16 days. As he went on to week 5, he noticed that he was at a pretty steady state, 294, 284, 295 for that LDL cholesterol. At which point he pushed the model a little. Instead of taking the recorded 10,000 steps in his day, he doubled the output of his muscles by recording 20,000 steps per day for the final week. And you'll notice the LDL cholesterol went from 295 to 346, a pretty striking rise in that bad cholesterol in just 1 week. So why would that happen? Well, as the demands from Nick's body doubled in the number of steps, he needed to circulate energy. And he was using lipid as his energy. So this lipid energy model now needed to increase the amount of circulating particles to get the energy delivered to the demands coming from his muscle. So let's summarize what we think was happening. In the Oreo experiment, with the liver filled full of glycogen, that output of VLDLs was nearly zero. So as he continued to recycle at a pretty hearty rate for his VLDL, the amount of input into the blood or circulation was very low amount of cholesterol, dropping it 70% in 16 days. As compared to the statin, where his body was in a state of ketosis, was using lipid as the energy model for delivery to his cells. And in this model, he didn't add sugar. He just depended on his body to deliver the fat whenever the demands were needed. When comparing it to the statin side of this experiment, he had shifted the energy model to just using fat. As he packaged that fat in his liver, produced those VLDLs, and then delivered triglycerides to any cell in need of energy, he doubled the recycling process, or at least in estimation. That rosuvastatin was increasing the receptors and pulling in the LDLs a little faster, while producing them at the same rate that his body was in need of. And in fact, when he increased the demand from his body produced even more of those VLDLs. Again, increasing the number in that last week of the study. All right, so what does this mean? Well, it does not mean that Oreos are healthy. It does not mean that you should be doing this experiment at home. But what it does mean is there is a huge conversation in the ketogenic space about to take place. So thanks to Nick Norowitz and his brave self-experimentation. And don't forget the funding from Dave Feldman's nonprofit organization called Citizens Science Foundation. This experiment is opening a conversation like we've never had before about LDL cholesterol. I have patients coming in every week saying, "Doc, I'm on the ketogenic diet, and although the metrics of health have improved dramatically, their brains work better, their autoimmune problems are better, and they've lost significant amount of fat weight." That LDL cholesterol is a very serious concern for what we should be doing. It's these kind of conversations that I keep my ear to the rail on. I am super thankful for, and I don't pretend to have the answer to this question. So how could you help? Well, the best thing you can do for Nick and the research behind it is to share the article, the scientific article linked in the show notes of this video. That article has a metric saying how many people are paying attention to this conversation. And from that metric comes other people's funding to answer the question, what should we do about LDL cholesterol in people who are truly ketogenic? Share the article and let's support Nick and his foundation.